good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to History and Systems of Psychology. I'm excited to be with you today, and we are going to start by recapping Chapter 10, which discusses social psychology. So I'd like to start there and hear from you in regard to some of the most important takeaways you see from that chapter. Some of our key characters were Mesmer, right? Talked about Mesmer a lot. Milgram, I asked you to read a video. No, you might have read the closed captioning, watch a video, and then also examine the Stanford prison experiment, right? Okay. We can start there or we can start somewhere else, but feel free to share your thoughts.
Certain things.
Yes.
The Stanford prison experiment, they went in a little bit into why he was studying that. The Milgram, I don't know if the video touched on it, but is the original, like, why do people subject to it? Is this a thing? Like, try to understand because of a lot of the Nazi trials. Like, everybody was, well, I only did it because I was ordered to.
That was the why behind it? Yes,
So a lot of times, like, just to me, anyway,
Yeah, I think that's really important. And our book, I think, does a fairly good job of doing that in most cases. All right, we will go ahead and recap the Stanford prison experiment. That was a social psychology experiment that was conducted at Stanford. And it was a setup of a prison. So it was what we would call a simulation study. So we had a simulated prison that was in the basement of one of the buildings at Stanford, correct? Okay. Who was in charge of that study? Who conceived this idea and put things together? Who is the researcher? Up on the board, yes, Zimbardo, yes. So when we talk about the Stanford prison experiment, that's almost synonymous with Zimbardo. It's what made him famous and infamous, probably, and was something that he parlayed, the results of that experiment, he parlayed it into a career and did a lot of things on the talk show circuit, wrote a lot about his topic, and yeah, very interesting man. So he wanted to simulate a prison in the basement and created that, right? He recruited subjects to participate in his study, but they weren't just any subjects, right? We're not grabbing random people. One should never grab random people off the street and coerce them into participating in a research study to begin with. But these were all students, right? Okay. Was there any sort of criteria they had to meet before they could participate?
Illegal trouble, basically past psych profiles. Mm-hmm. So no history of psychological problems.
Exactly,
And no major health issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Zimbardo really did vet these people and make sure that they were okay. He was going to exclude anyone who presented with psychological problems. And so to that end, he had a battery of psychological assessments that everyone took. They needed to be a student. And what was the other thing you said? I'm sorry. Nope.
Mentally, physically well, no
criminal record, yes, exactly. All right, so people sign up, they get paid a little bit of money, and the experiment begins. Okay, everyone with me? All right, so the Stanford prison experiment started, and it was highly staged. People were separated into either guards or prisoners, and they didn't know in advance which side they would be on, all right? The prisoners were picked up in police cars. Can you imagine that? So pretty real life, and taken to the basement where the prison was. Okay. Once there, what happens? So now you have your guards and your prisoners together, and we're getting ready to begin the study. What happened next?
So it was intake, but I think it was.
He basically gave the guards instructions, really vague, just like basically keep order.
Yes.
And never gave them specifics.
Right. Zimbardo said he was functioning as the warden, but as we find out throughout the experiment, that wasn't really the case. I mean, if you had a warden like Zimbardo, he would be fired from a prison almost immediately. But that was the idea. So the guards were given instructions. An important part of this is that they were given a uniform. All right. Also, the prisoners were given a uniform. And so that illustrates the fact that, or he wanted to see how much do people sort of take on a role they're given. So, and that's a big part of it, right? You can think of a doctor in a white coat taking on that role, and I think we've talked about this in class, white coat syndrome, where once people see someone in a white coat, their blood pressure goes up, right? Because they think a syringe is going to come out of the pocket. I don't know. Prisoners also were able to wear glasses, all right? So what happens when someone's in sunglasses?
The guards.
The guards, I'm sorry, yeah, not the prisoners.
You avoid. So yeah, basically one way.
Make eye contact.
Uh-huh, yeah.
You avoid direct gaze.
Yeah, you avoid a direct gaze. So it's easier, and I think the same could be said for social media, when you are not making eye contact with someone to do or say things that you, with sunglasses removed, would maybe not do in a normal situation. Anyway, it was amazing how quickly both parties took on their roles. That was established almost immediately. There wasn't much or any coaching that Zimbardo needed to do. All right. Things were sort of okay in the beginning. Once those roles were taken on, though, they were taken on to the extreme. Okay. So by day 2, what was starting to happen with the prisoners?
Basically
His Zimbardo's attempts to kind of dehumanize the prisoners were really starting to work.
Yeah.
Remember, this detonated also.
So the prisoners were dehumanized, and that was done in several different ways. And all of these are going to be some exam questions, so I just want to mention that. By stripping them of their clothes, so that strips them of their sort of some of their personality, right? And now they're all in the same uniform, which was basically just sort of like a white sheet sort of looking thing, right? They also were given numbers. Sounds a lot like what happened in Germany, right? So rather than being called by a name, now they're referred to as prisoner 8572. Okay? You dehumanize a person, it's probably much easier to be punitive to 8572 than to John Smith, right? Once that had occurred, then we see prisoners starting to break down because the guards are really getting harsh with their punishments, harsh with the words they're saying. And eventually, the experiment is shut down, right, due to how volatile the situation has become and how many of the prisoners have had anxiety attacks and full-on breakdowns wanting to leave, okay? I'm not sure if the video mentioned this or not, but I wonder how long the experiment would have continued had Zimbardo's girlfriend at the time not intervened. Okay, so she comes in, I don't know if it's day 5 or 6, but around that time, and is like, what is going on? It's mass chaos, people are breaking down, punishment, loud, all these things. And she tells Zimbardo, I can't believe that you did this. I can't believe that you are allowing this to continue. And so with that, the experiment was discontinued. Okay? From that, we learned a lot, however, about how people take on roles that they're given. And this leads us to something in sociology, which we call labeling or labeling theory, all right? And this can happen in a variety of contexts. So let's say that a child is labeled as needing special education services, okay? That label is then known to his teachers, right? To the parent, to the child themselves. And what it's done is it's not done in a punitive way. It's meant for the student to receive the services they need. Unfortunately, once that label is given, the child might take on that label and start to see themselves maybe as nothing more than their disability in English. Okay, so they have a specific learning disability and they start to see themselves in that light, and the way that people interact with them changes. So we have to be really careful of labeling. We've seen instances throughout time of what happens when we separate into factions and label and sort of take on an us versus them mentality. So I just wanted to mention that because that social psychology part really bleeds into the field of sociology. Okay, all right. Zimbardo spent much of the rest of his life talking about this experiment in an interview that was done relatively close to his death, which I think he died within the last year. He was asked near the end of the interview if he thought this was an ethical study, and he said absolutely not. One more thing I want to mention is that this study took place before the establishment of an institutional review board. So this was when more in the Wild West days of research, all right? You didn't have to get special permissions to conduct a study. It didn't go through this process of informed consent. It didn't go through the process of other people looking at the research and making sure you're not going to harm anyone, right? So after studies like this, the Institutional Review Board was established, and now any research institution, be it college, university, medical institution that receives federal funds for conducting research, has to have an Institutional Review Board. And they would make sure a study like this didn't take place, okay? That would probably be like, we're rejecting this, and no modification is going to make this okay. But you know, you might be able to conduct a study on the extent to which people take on roles they're given in another way, right? This was just one very dramatic way of doing so. In doing this, Zimbardo became very well known not only in the field of social psychology, but in the field of research ethics as to things that you want to avoid doing. All right. Any other words on that or thoughts, takeaways from that experiment? Okay. What I want to do now is go ahead and back up to Milgram. I believe Milgram's experiment took place a little earlier in time than Zimbardo's did. Okay. These two overlap, okay? Milgram was Jewish, and he fled Nazi Germany. One of his major questions as a social psychologist is, how do people who are normal, upstanding people suddenly do things completely out of character because someone else in a position of authority tells them to do so? So that was a major thing. We're going to test the influence of authority on behavior, okay? The experiment was set up, and hopefully you watched the video, with some Confederates, so some people that were in on the experiment, correct? And were the participants told in advance what would be studied? Were they told this is going to be an experiment on authority? No. I believe they were told they were going to be doing some sort of learning or memory experiment. Okay. So we have a lab, and at the time in the 60s, it was pretty high tech. Today we would look at it and go, wow, that's really retro looking. But so there was a lab that was set up, and each sort of cubby had a shock generator. He called it the shock generator. And there were little tabs that you pushed that went from mild shock all the way to extreme risk of death kind of shock. Okay. So the actual participants in the study who think that they're doing a study on memory task come to their little cubby, all right? They're escorted by someone in a white coat, and they sit down at the shock generator, all right? What happens next is the Confederates who are in on the experiment begin this process, okay? And what happens is when the Confederates get an answer wrong, the participants are asked to shock them, okay, by the person in the white coat. So the person in authority is saying, you need to shock these people when they are incorrect, when they don't get the answer right, okay? So as time goes on during the span of the experiment, each time you shock, you're moving up, right? You're moving up that shock generator chain. As that got more toward, like, if we say it's on a scale of 1 to 10, more toward the 5 and 6 range, we see people, participants, who become really leery of continuing. Because each time that person is shocked, they feign distress, all right? So you're hearing them, maybe they're screaming, or saying, please stop, okay? People had varied reactions to that. So when it gets to like 6 or 7, a lot of people are saying, you know, I really don't want to continue. And the person in the coat says, you have to continue. It's part of the study. Go ahead. You know, but I don't want to do this. About 65% of people set aside their own beliefs that they wouldn't shock this person to abide by the authority figure. Okay, so these were people who, although likely they wouldn't do this in real life without an authority figure, with one present, they kept going up that shock generator. And what happened is they sort of pushed aside any responsibility they had. They separated themselves and said, well, I'm not really the person responsible. I'm just carrying out the duties. And that sounds a whole lot like World War II, right? So there you see all of that wrapping in. How many of you had an opportunity to read the article on Milgram? Okay, some of you. All right. Many times Milgram's presented in this way, and then after, if we're talking about research ethics, people talk about, well, that was pretty unethical to put the participants in this position, and, you know, maybe they have trauma and all sorts of negative impacts from this. The main impact with the participants is they didn't necessarily like the fact that they did that, right? So after, and that was the main issue. The experiment began with deception, which in this case I think you would have had to have, okay? But they were given a debriefing. So unlike what a lot of sites say online, Milgram didn't just walk away and have no contact with people after. He did a debriefing where he told them what the experiment was about and talked with all the participants. And most of them didn't report like great distress. But that's really overlooked in what's presented. You know, oftentimes online we get like this sensationalized thing, the shock generator. And some, I've looked online at some that even say they were shocked, right? Like that's all bogus. And a lot of people said he hadn't done his homework leading up to the experiment. But if you read the article about Milgram by his friend, I think his first name's Stanley, Stanley Milgram, his friend who wrote the book, was also a professor. He said Milgram made sure that this was okay to do. He consulted psychiatrists, psychologists. So after the fact, we find out that maybe we shouldn't be pointing the finger so much at him. I really loved it when I came across this article from the Psychi Journal or magazine, because I'd been teaching Milgram in a way that's similar to how it's taught by a lot of people. And once I found that information, I thought, whenever I talk about him and present the experiment, I need to make sure you have that information. So there are two sides of a coin in many cases, not in all. But so that was another social psychology experiment that's very, very famous. And then if we bump back a little bit, of course, we have Mesmer, right? Didn't start out as a social psychology experiment in any way, the mesmerism, but we found out that social psychology forces were at work, right? And this idea of social conformity was very strong. And also the influence of someone, of suggestion, okay? So what came out of mesmerism that we talked about last week? Another field that's sort of sketchy too. Yeah, good, hypnotism, right? So this idea of maybe we don't need to have people swallow iron filings and be, submerge a rod in this tub of water and place their heads around it, to get healed. Like maybe we don't have to do all that. Maybe any healing that's taking place is more just the power of social suggestion. And so that's what hypnotism was. It was a way to suggest like maybe a cure for people who had hysteria, because that was really big back in the day. And hypnotism was found to be somewhat successful, right? It was also used as anesthesia. Can you imagine? Last week we talked about the cancer patient who had hypnotic, quote unquote, anesthesia and went through the operation just fine. I don't know how much that's used today, but I thought that was really interesting to see. Hypnotism is still, used for sort of non-psychological purposes. It can be a source of entertainment. For some reason, like comedy clubs seem to have their fair share of hypnotists who come, right? It's sort of like an act that they'll do. Hypnotherapy is still practiced. I worked when I was vice president of the Oklahoma Eating Disorders Association. I worked with someone who had finished her training in hypnotherapy. And it was a pretty rigorous program that she went to. Of course, all programs are not created equal, but she felt there was a lot of validity in doing that, and so she studied that. So that's something that you may have a therapist. I know Dr. O'Malley has a friend who uses hypnotherapy with his clients, so you can find that, but it's not super common, not super common today. Hypnotherapy will lead eventually to our friend Freud. So the next person after we finish talking about behaviorism we'll be looking at is, in the great man approach, is Sigmund Freud. All right. Any questions about the social psychology chapter? I feel like that's been a pretty thorough, we've been pretty thorough and detailed in that, but please correct me if that's not the case, or if you have any questions you'd like me to answer. Yeah.
So what names would you want us to commonly associate
Yeah,
with
let's
hypnotism?
look at that. The big names in hypnotism.
Yes, that's the only one I really have.
They talk about Charcot some. You need to have a rudimentary understanding of Charcot, which is on page 372. And remember we talked about Blanche Whitman? She was the queen of what? Hysteria, yeah. So you could mention that. One more thing I would say, I think it would be good if this were an essay question to mention Binet, Alfred Binet, even though he became most widely known for intelligence testing. he spent some time in hypnotism, which I find very interesting. So what do we say? Charcot, Blanche, and Binet. Okay. Yeah, you're very welcome. Anything else? All right. Well, we are going to slide back into behaviorism. But before I do that, I want to talk about some assignments that are going to be due because we're very rapidly approaching the end of the semester, right? I think we're done in less than a month. Yeah. So that's good, right? But also might be a source of a little anxiety depending on the classes you have and what's expected of you toward the end of the semester. So I just want to make sure that you have a handle on this and you can plan ahead. We will have exam 3 opening a week from Wednesday. I'll provide you with a study guide in class this Thursday. We'll go over the study guide on Tuesday, and then the exam will open on Wednesday of the following week, right? Not this week, but next Wednesday, and it'll close Sunday at 11:55 p.m. Okay? All right. The exam will cover chapters, I believe it's 8, 9, 10, and what we get through of 11. The content that we cover on Freud today and on Thursday. Okay, so you have that. And then the final exam is not going to be cumulative. All right? It's going to cover the remainder of chapters that we end up discussing. And we have, because of the snow days sort of piling up on us, we have not gotten as far as I would have liked to have gotten. The chapters that I want to make sure we cover, of course, is the chapter on psychoanalysis, on personality psychology, and on humanistic psychology. So those will be the 3 chapters. You'll basically be responsible for the second half of chapter 11 and then those other 2 chapters. You will be able to take that exam anytime during the week of finals, and it's going to be the same setup as all other exams, all right? Any questions about the upcoming exams? All right. I know I've mentioned the photo voice assignment. I want to give you a due date for that. That's going to also be due the last day of exam week. So I'm going to actually give you until the Sunday of finals week to turn that in, which I want to say puts us on like the 11th or 12th. Does that sound of May? Does that sound right? The 11th? Okay. So May 11th at 11:55 p.m.
Is there criteria being posted for that yet?
Let's take a look. I'm doing something similar in another class, and I know I posted it for them, but I need to make sure that if I've not done that, that I take care of that for you. Let me look in announcements first. And then I'll look in content. I know we have a lot here. I don't know that I do. Has anyone come across that? Okay. So let me talk to you for a moment about that. We good on all this? Okay. Okay. You're going to create this project in PowerPoint. Okay. You will have a total of 6 slides. That's a title slide. Wow, that's a phonetic spelling for you. So you're going to name your project. I love creativity, but you could name your project Final Photo Voice Project if that's what you want to do, okay? So you have a title page, okay? And that'll have your title of the project. If you want to have some sort of image, you may have that. And then your name, the date, and the class. So just pretty much like if you were writing a paper, what you would have on the first page of that paper, okay? Following, you're going to have 5 slides. Okay. All right. Let's say that you were really mesmerized by Mesmer. Bad joke, right? And you found, so these 5 slides are going to be the 5 people using the Great Man approach that you found most interesting, all right? And let's say one of those people is Mesmer. So I'm going to have a second slide, slide 2, and it's going to have Mesmer. And you're going to basically, in no more than 10 sentences, talk about Mesmer. You'll need a tad in terms of when he was born, where he lived. So a little bit of information related to early life. The bulk of your summary, so to speak, is going to be focused on what you see as the major important takeaways from his theory, all right, from all the work that he did. What do you see as most important or most central to that, okay? And then, so the 8 to 10 sentences, let's use about 8 sentences for that, okay? So those sorts of things. And then the last 2 sentences are going to explain why you took the photo that you did. Okay, so, and I want you to try to be a little out of the box on this. So for Mesmer, I could be really pretty basic, and I could have like a kiddie pool. So this is, you know, like the pool where people were mesmerized, right? I could do something like that. What else would be sort of just, I shouldn't say no-brainer, but I'm kind of going to say that. Yes, well, that's kind of like, you know, sort of straightforward. Yeah. Iron filings, like here I have iron filings, or I have a magnet for Mesmer. Like, I want you to go a little bit beyond that and think about something that's more of an abstraction of the concept. That's part of the fun part of doing this, I think. I prefer assignment like this always growing up, or when I was in college, to a paper. So I want you to have fun with it and really, really think about a little bit of an out-of-the-box idea, so to speak. Okay? So you'll do that for each of the 5 people that you find to be most interesting, or the 5 that you think left the most lasting legacies. And the instructions that I have are going to be super straightforward, all right? I have a huge problem with plagiarism. I have a huge problem, although I'm going to have to get used to it. I'm going to have to start accepting AI as a force that's not going away in classes, but as a professor, I'm still trying to figure it out because so much has happened in such a short time, and as a university, we're starting to figure that out as well. But there's really no reason for anyone but you to write this summary, okay? And I will also tell you, many times, even if it's not picked up as AI, when people write using it, it's just like different. Or if I look at work from someone throughout the semester and all of a sudden see like a different writer's voice, I can kind of tell. So just, I don't think you'll go there, but just please don't go there, because I want to hear what you have to say. Like that's a big part of that as a professor, okay? I want to hear your voice. So do that for your 5 slides. Okay.
And then we have to record ourselves reading them?
You do not have to record yourself. Was everyone going to look back at Christina and go? No, Christina. So photo voice, I definitely understand you're thinking photo and voice. That makes perfect sense to me. This is a good time to talk just a tiny bit about photo voice method. So not going to be on the exam, but I want you to know about it. Kind of like that stats day we had, right? We're doing photo voice as you would do in a classroom, okay? But photo voice came about in 1997. Wang and Burris wrote what they call the seminal article in Photo Voice and talked about this new participatory action research, PAR, all right? The idea behind photo voice, as Wang and Burris conceptualized it, was to give voice to people who were voiceless, people who had been marginalized in communities for some reason. Maybe they didn't feel like their voices were heard. So this was giving those people an opportunity to speak and share their thoughts, concerns, ideas about, let's say, a particular topic, okay? And the original method was that people would be given a series of questions, so maybe 2 or 3 questions about a particular topic that was important to that group of people. And they would take pictures rather than their answers would be a picture they would take, okay? Once all the pictures had been taken, they would set up a time to meet with the researcher. And those pictures would become a springboard for the interview that would take place. So, you can get a certain amount of information through an interview, and in and of itself, it's not necessarily a bad thing. But they're coming in with stuff, right, which is really can be very meaningful for someone. And they share these photos with the researcher. You may share it one-on-one, or something that's great if you can do it as a focus group, so people can talk about this collectively. I'm not going to go over this in much detail, but I will send you the article. Originally, interview responses were given according to the SHOWED method. So there would be specific questions that were set that the researchers would ask in response to each of the photos. Like, show me the problem, or, why is this important? What can we do? Okay? And then all of that information, according to Photo Voice as it originated, would be used to enact change. Okay, so ideally, if you're doing something like this, it's a community project. Maybe it's something we want to look at issues in rural communities. Okay, we would have people do the focus group, share their ideas, and then do some sort of presentation. And the presentation could take place, at a university setting. You'd have to get consent from the IRB to do this, or in a public setting, which is always great. And then the participants would be there, and you can do it a lot of different ways, but you could maybe have different screens and the photos and quotes here. But to have the participants there as well to talk about it is really powerful. And so what comes out of that, hopefully, is not just research for its own sake, but research that actively engages and has participants think and results in positive change, right? That's hopefully what we ultimately want research not to just stay in a journal that's read like by 5 people who are experts in that. Yeah. So that's how it started out. but it's used in a lot of different ways. Dr. O'Malley and I published an article, it's probably been 5 years or so, that talked about using photo voice in the classroom. So you can apply it as much or as little as you want to, but for anyone who's going to be having to do capstone, I think that's a wonderful research tool. Okay? All right. Not too long of a discussion. We need to circle back to our behaviorism PowerPoint, which lives here, I think. Hooray. All right. The first behaviorist you were introduced to in this class was Pavlov, correct? Okay. And Pavlov did not set out to be a psychologist in any way, shape, or form. He was interested in the digestive process. And I need to back up to the correct. The start of chapter 9, the chapter begins like this. Around the turn of the 20th century, the eminent Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov felt troubled. He had just completed a monumental set of studies on the physiology of digestion and was seeking new scientific challenges. Okay? He questioned whether what he was studying truly fell within the domain of science. Okay? What he starts to study, or what he proposed to study, was a type of salivary reaction he called psychic secretions, all right? And that's where we've talked about it in class, get the dogs. He studied the digestion of dogs, and then we have the bell. I feel like we're good on that. Is that true? All right. He won his Nobel Prize for the work he did on digestion. And he was highly skilled. I hate to think of the little dogs having little holes and things in their bods, but that happened. And then he was able to observe these processes. The digestive system is super duper complex, okay? All right, but what he had to do about psychology, he said, it is open to question whether psychology is a natural science or whether it can be regarded as a science at all. Pavlov thought of himself as a rigorous, completely scientific physiologist, and he feared being associated with the soft-minded psychologist. Okay. So, what came after the studies that he conducted with stimulus and response was this idea of unconditioned reflexes. And he spent the latter part of his life studying reflexes in great detail. Okay. Right. There's an experiment that you need to be aware of, or something that you need to be aware of, called generalization and differentiation. So if you'd like to, I'm on page 324. All right. We have the classic Pavlovian experiment. We have a bowl of food, right? We have a bell that's introduced with a bowl of food. Dog drools, a lot or a little, you know, and then eats the food, all right? Over time, that pairing of the food with the bell, we remove the food. And then the response, the salivary response happens in every time the bell is rung, right? Okay. With generalization and differentiation, you can have similar stimuli. So let's say that a bigger bell was used. That's probably going to be okay. Maybe you do one of those, like a honk, one of those honk, and that works and produces the same, elicits the same response. But the further you get away from the original stimuli, the harder it's going to be to have that happen, right? So there's needs to be some sort of similar stimuli, okay? Okay. At the fourth paragraph on page 324, it says, or leading into it, the greater the dissimilarity between the conditioned and test stimuli, the weaker the generalized response. So it may be that the honk results in something much weaker response. If the dissimilar stimulus was then presented repeatedly, but never reinforced by a succeeding unconditioned stimulus, another kind of learning occurred that Pavlov called differentiation. Okay. One of the experiments that he talks about, or they talk about, is Pavlov's experiments testing the limits of an animal's ability to differentiate, okay? I don't know how many of you have dogs and cats, but you know, if you've seen a picture of how big their brains are, they're not huge, you know, compared to ours. And so differentiation for them, I hope, looks different than for us. Okay, and their ability to generalize also looks different than ours does. It says, in the circle ellipse differentiation, they started with a very oblong ellipse. Okay, so you know what ellipse looks like. When the dog stopped salivating to that image, the researchers shifted to another one that was less oblong and more circular. Okay, so we're changing the shape of this figure. So it takes some time, and then the animal's like, you know, like that's different, right? That was oblong, and now they're not shaking their heads, and now this is more of a circular situation. But that's going on some level. So after they successfully differentiated that image from the circle, they tried one that was more circular still, and so on, progressively reducing the difference between the stimuli. When the non-reinforced stimulus became almost circular, a sudden and dramatic change came over the dog's behavior. So they were pretty calm and docile as these, you know, different items were in their line of vision. The animal now made frantic efforts to escape from its apparatus. You're not hitting me with a rectangle, right? Like that's a severe case, okay? And remained agitated long afterward. In fact, animals forced to confront this ambiguous stimulus for very long continued to be disturbed for weeks or months after the experiment, leading to something that he called experimental neurosis. So we saw that first in animals. A dramatic behavioral change when animal subjects were first forced to confront an ambiguous differentiation task. And this seemed to be similar to stress-induced breakdowns in humans, which is very interesting. Okay. All right, this leads us to John B. Watson, the person who memorably said, I can raise a child to become a criminal, a doctor, a nurse, a businessman, a homeless person, right? Based on what? Everyone with me? What did he believe impacted our behavior? Christina, I thought you were going to say something. No. No? You guys with me? The environment, okay? So we're going to shape this child into, hopefully you would shape a child not to become a criminal, but I guess you could with what you the rewards and punishments you give them. Is this coming back? And then we talked about rewards and punishment in grade school and the puzzle box and all of those things. And I told you about the cereal. Yeah? Okay. Okay. So what behaviorism did is they said, to heck with all this introspection. That's wiggly. We can't count on it. And on and on and on. Okay, so very negative things to say about introspection. And instead, we want something that's hardcore, rigorous, and scientific, which also at the same time meant very straightforward. So they are suggesting that learning is based on the acquisition and interconnection of associations through various forms of conditioning, and that we can measure the change by looking at people, okay? That we influence the way people act by how we act toward them. And that was a huge break to what had been going on before. Just a little bit of background into John Watson. He was the son of what our book says is a wayward father. I don't know what that means, and a deeply religious mother. He was named after a fundamentalist minister that lived nearby, and his mom just was like, please become a minister. Please do not become wayward, right, like your father, but go into the ministry. And how many times have we heard this with people who become eminent psychologists, right? The clergy's the place to be. He was steered that way, but it did not stick. He had a fierce, rebellious streak that became a permanent part of his character, and his aggressiveness in adolescence earned him the nickname Swats. He even got arrested for fighting and firing a gun outside of city limits. Oh, inside city limits, I'm sorry. He recalled that at school I was lazy, somewhat insubordinate, and never made above a passing grade. Okay? So at 16, though, he does well enough, I suppose, and is going into a school to study to become a clergyman. Some things happen, and he ends up graduating from this school over time with a graduate degree, and it's not in theology or anything related to that, but rather, during the extra year that he had in school, Watson's mother died, and so he no longer had any pressure to become a minister. He now made a resolve to upstage his professor that he had at the time by earning a PhD one day and making the older man come to him for training later. So there's a big ego on him, similar to some other people that we've studied, right? He was admitted to the philosophy and psychology department at the University of Chicago in 1900. And he found something that he excelled in, which was actually animal psychology. And there's some videos I want to post for you in case you'd like to just see more of this at work. But that was something that he became very well known for. And he started to gather a bevy of graduate students who were interested in something similar. And a lot of times at psychology departments, that's what happens. You have a group of people who are interested in a similar thing, and then over time, that psychology department might become really well known for animal psychology, or really known for neuroscience and the treatment of people with Alzheimer's. Okay. Watson believed that we have only 3 unconditioned reactions to stimuli. Fear. One of the 3 innate emotional reactions in infants, elicited, not surprisingly, by sounds and unexpected loud sounds or the sudden loss of support, whether that's literally you get dropped or whether you don't have support from a caregiver. Okay, so for the exam, you'll need to know and describe these a little bit. So the fear response, rage, elicited when movement is constrained or restricted, okay? And again, that can be you're literally bound up, or you feel like maybe you're working a job and it's a situation you feel like you can do a lot more, you want to be more autonomous, but you're having to sort of like stay in your lane, and you're getting a lot of something that I abhor, micromanaging from above, okay? And so I know for me that's something that I don't have at this job, which is one of the many, many reasons I love being a professor, but that I'm entrusted to like do what I'm supposed to do and know kind of what I'm doing and talking about. So that could be a source of rage for someone, right? And then we have love. One of the 3 emotional innate reactions elicited by stroking the erogenous zones. That one's really straightforward, okay? So there you go. And I taught human sexuality one semester. I was terribly uncomfortable, so I'm not going to go any more into the erogenous zones, all right? We're going to head on. Okay. We are now moving to the Little Albert experiment. How many of you have heard of the Little Albert experiment? Okay. Did we talk about it in class at all?
I don't think so.
Okay, all right. What animal was involved in the Little Albert experiment? To begin with, right? Okay. So we have little Albert, who cannot consent to participate in research because he's little, all right? Let's go ahead and turn to the book. I don't have time to show you the video, but I have posted something about this, all right? Let's see. Okay. All right, so picture this. So you're going to have to go like in your mind's eye until you watch the video. They conditioned Albert, an 11-month-old son of a wet nurse in the hospital adjacent to their infant laboratory, to fear a white rat. Okay, so at first the child sees it and thinks what about the white rat? Okay, doesn't have preconceived notions of what a white rat is, and it's kind of scurrying about and looks like a fun plaything. It makes little eepy noises and has a little tail, so that's kind of fun, right? So intro to White Mouse. And the goal of this experiment was to elicit fear when he saw a white mouse. Okay? So, they inserted an unconditioned stimulus. And what that was any time the child saw the white rat, they loudly struck a steel bar with a hammer just behind Albert's head. Okay? So first week this goes on and he's not crying, and then his reactions become more and more severe in response to the stimulus. Okay. Watson and his colleague tested for generalization. So remember we talked about that oblong shape turning more into a circle, and to what extent can you generalize this stimulus? So they went to other white furry things. So like a rabbit, a puppy, a cat, cotton wool, and a Santa Claus mask. Now that might be scary just in and of itself, but that's another thing. Okay. Then Watson put his own hair, which was showing streaks of white, near the child, and got a poetically just response. Albert really didn't have a response. He began to play with their hair, all right? Over time, though, seeing these animals that are similar to the white rat start to elicit these responses. They're not as strong as in relationship to the white rat, but they're pretty strong. And so over time, what happens, everyone, is that he starts to fear anything that has these qualities of a white rat. Does that make sense? Okay. And everything produced a fear response, which is not necessarily something you want to condition a child to have. This ties in with radical environmentalism, a view put forth by Watson suggesting that environmental factors had an overwhelmingly greater importance than heredity in determining behavior. Okay. I have a video that I would like for you to watch on your own time that talks about Skinner. And so, that talks about Watson. Later in Watson's life, he became very interested and successful in advertising. So I'm going to talk about that for just a second. At the bottom of page 336, he moved to New York and began a new phase of his career. He received job offers from the New School for Social Research. That sounds good. And the J. Walter Thompson Advertising Agency. This is back in the, not this time. $25,000 per year was a lot. And that was 4 times what the university offered him, okay? So he starts to go into advertising. Choosing advertising over academia eased his sense of loss because his reputation was sort of tainted after Lil Albert. And he plunged into his new career with typical vigor. He got practical sales experience. He worked part-time as a clerk in Macy's department store. And says, I began to learn that it can be just as thrilling to watch the growth of a sales curve, so using the concepts of behaviorism to market, as to watch the learning curves of animals or man. Okay? So he parlayed his interest and expertise in behaviorism into a career as a super successful advertiser, right? Sort of interesting. Leads us to B.F. Skinner. And I think I have a short video to show you on Skinner. Let's see. So B.F. Skinner, when we talk about him, we're talking about something called operant conditioning. And so this last part of class, we're going to watch a video which discusses that, I think, in really easy to understand terms in about 5 minutes. Oh my gosh. Okay, sorry. That was super loud. Let's see. Okay. You never know from one video to the next how loud it's going to be. Let's see if this is better. Did that elicit a fear response?
In this video, we're going to go over reinforcement schedules.
Is that okay?
So far, when we've been looking at operant conditioning, we haven't really discussed when the animal is going to get a reward for performing the behavior. So we've sort of been assuming that we've been having continuous reinforcement, which is whenever the animal performs the behavior, they will get the reward. However, this is not often the way that studies are performed with operant conditioning. There are different types of reinforcement schedules that we're going to go over. The first is fixed ratio. In a fixed ratio reinforcement schedule, the reinforcement occurs after a fixed number of behavioral responses. So in this case, a rodent is going to be given the reward, the food, for pushing a lever, but the rodent is not given a reward after each lever press. Instead, every 5 lever presses will result in the reward. So when the rodent pushes the lever 5 times, or 10 times, 15 times, and 20 times, they will get a reward. So after 20 lever presses, they get a total of 4 rewards and 1 reward after every 5 lever presses. This form of reinforcement schedule will result with a high response rate with pauses after the reinforcement. So that means the animal is going to be motivated to want to push the lever to get the reward. And after they get the reward, there's usually a pause because they know that they're not going to get a reward anytime soon. They have to do more work. Next, we have variable ratio. So this is a form of reinforcement where the reinforcements are given after a variable number of behavioral responses. So in this case, the rodent again is going to push a lever for the reward of food. However, it's not given consistently after a number of lever presses. So in this case, maybe they'll get a reward after the 3rd lever press, the 10th lever press, the 14th, and the 20th lever press. So you can see that over 20 lever presses, they also got 4 rewards, but when they get the reward is variable. Sometimes it's after 3 lever presses, sometimes it's after 7 lever presses, 4 lever presses, or 6 lever presses. This form of reinforcement schedule results in a high and consistent response rate. So this is a very powerful form of operant conditioning. And an example of this for humans is gambling. So with gambling, if people are sitting by slot machines, they'll just play the game over and over again. They don't know when they're going to get the reward because it's, in a way, sort of random. But when they get a reward, it can be highly rewarding. But again, with the variable ratio, it results in a high and consistent response rate. So people will just sit and play the slot machines for a very long time, and it can be very addicting. Next, we have fixed interval. So fixed interval occurs when the reinforcement is given for the first response after a fixed amount of time has elapsed. So in this case, it doesn't matter how many times the rodent pushes the lever within a given time frame, they'll only get a certain number of rewards for amount of time. So for instance, here, a rodent can get a reward for pushing a lever after 5, 10, 15, and 20 minutes. So that means in the first 5 minutes, they can push the lever, and when they push the lever the first time, they'll get a reward. But if they push the lever a second, third, or fourth time within that 5 minutes, they won't get another reward. They have to wait another 5 minutes before they can push a lever to get a second reward. After getting that second reward, they have to wait another 5 minutes. So it's fixed interval. They get a reward after a fixed amount of time has passed. Using this reinforcement schedule, you get moderate response rates with long pauses after reinforcement. So once the animal is trained, they learn that they have to wait a long time before they can push the lever to get any reward. So they certainly essentially have learned that just pushing the lever continuously isn't going to get anything, that after getting a reward, they have to wait. Finally, we have variable interval. So this is when the animal will get the reinforcement after a variable amount of time has passed. So as an example, the rodent can get the reward of food after pushing the lever, maybe after 4 minutes, after 10 minutes, after 13 minutes, and after 20 minutes. So in this case, the rodent still has to wait, but they don't know how long they need to wait. They don't know if they need to wait 4 minutes, 10 minutes, 3 minutes, 7 minutes. It's variable. So in this case, you get a moderate and steady response rate. So what you can notice here is that fixed ratio and variable ratio will produce higher response rates than fixed interval and variable interval. And you'll also see that when you have a variable ratio or variable interval, you get a more consistent response rate. Okay, so these are the different
Okay, I think that was a really easy to understand explanation of those different reinforcement schedules. I've started to do classical conditioning on my cat Mirabelle, and I'm going to see if I can make this happen before the end of the semester. So she loves to eat. She would eat until she exploded, left to her own devices. So she's not exactly a cat that you can just place a bowl of food and she'll daintily like peck at it, right? She just goes like all in. Yeah. Like that, like a dog, right? She's a Maine Coon cat, so she does have some characteristics. I'm giving her a little bit of leeway because of that. And then also, so I want something out of it. I want to be able to hold her like a baby. Is that mean? Is that needy? Probably needy, maybe a little mean. So what I'm doing right now is in the morning, and when I see her later at night, I'm holding her. And then I'm holding her for a certain amount of time until she kind of goes and, goes out or flops out or bites me. And then I'm presenting her with food. Okay. So I've done that for like the past 3 days. And so far, she hasn't let me hold her very long. But what I want is I want to be able to just get her to want me to hold her. Does that make sense? Okay. So I'm doing that with food as a component in that, like as a reward for her doing that. So I guess actually that's more of operant conditioning. So her reward is food if she allows me to hug and squeeze her, right? Okay. I'll let you know how that goes. I need to take I'll take video tonight. Okay. I want you to spend the last 5 minutes just in a free write. You can do this on your computer or on a piece of paper. Based on everything we've covered in class, what do you think is might be most meaningful to your future career? Okay, so of everyone we've covered, the different theories, just a 5-minute free write, okay? Yes, So write as long as you can now. If you want to write more after we're finished, you definitely can, but use this time.